Hello and welcome back to the Northwood Podcast. I say welcome back because we've been on hiatus for over a year now. Sorry about that. There were a variety of reasons I don't need to get into, but the point is, we are back. And if you don't know about the Northwood Podcast, it's a podcast produced by Northwood Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. What you are about to hear is the message that I will bring on any given Sunday. You should be hearing this in the days after I preach the message live in church in front of our community. And speaking of our community, you are very welcome to come to our church. We are small but mighty, often achieving things that seem far beyond our capacity. From our food pantry to the ways we engage our community, we are making an impact, and if you feel the Spirit stirring in you to check us out, please do so. You can find our info at www.indncc.org. That's www.indncc.org. Or you might reach out to me directly by writing into me and my email at Heath, that's Heath, at indncc.org. That's Heath at indncc.org. In today's message, we'll be going over some sayings of Jesus from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 9. But before we get to that, we have to pause for some ads, and so here are some ads, and we'll see you after them.
Your day moves fast. Your news should too. That's why there's a new and improved Wish TV app bringing you more local news, breaking alerts, live streaming, weather forecast, radar, and Indiana sports all in one place. Customize your news feed to see the stories that matter most to you and get the information you need when you need it. Download the new and improved Wish TV app today on iOS or Android and take News 8 with you everywhere.
And we're back. And our scripture passage that we will be considering, that will be our leaping off point for our discussion, is found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9, and we'll be reading through verses 14 through 17. And it goes. Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "The wedding attendants cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them, can they? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak, for the patch pulls away from the cloak, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. Otherwise, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are ruined. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." More on that in a moment. But first, a recollection. If you were raised in church, no doubt you were raised in a specific tradition, in a specific denomination, or perhaps no denomination, but still specific, at least independent. Or what I guess I'm saying is you were raised in a specific church, in a specific time, and in a specific place. And each of these specificities narrows our experiences, but this is the only way. After all, you can't grow up or exist in all places and all times at once, and so just by the way that life works, you will find yourself in a unique context, uniquely your own, and different from many, if not nearly every other. So our finite existence does come with its limitations. As for myself, I was raised in a church called Colfax Wesleyan Church. This is a church from a denomination called Wesleyan, which is a breakaway from a broader tradition called Methodism. Rest assured, we had our distinctions, customs, and specific ways things were done. But I didn't know it. At least in my earliest years, church was just church, and I thought it's the way everything goes in every other place. As a child, I was unaware of the big, wide world of churches, denominations, and traditions. The only other churches I was allowed to go to were a lot like my own. For example, sometimes I'd attend church with my grandparents. They also went to a Wesleyan church. So beyond some cosmetic changes, everything substantial was basically the same. We sang the same songs. The order of the service was basically the same. And the sermon topics were very much aligned. There was one tradition or practice that I thought was practiced in every other church. I was wrong, I would come to find out. It's called an altar call. My church community placed it in the most central place of our worship, and I couldn't imagine a church service without it. I'm speaking here of a moment where you go forward at a moment in the service when you are called to do so. Have you ever heard of this? Do you know what an altar call is? Perhaps you do, but just in case you don't, I'll fill you in some more detail. At the front of the sanctuary was a long kneeling bench that we called the altar. It ran the entire width of the sanctuary just in front of the stage where the pulpit was. It was on the floor at the same level as the pews and those sitting in them. It was basically a rail about thigh high with a soft cushion built in on the floor where our knees would go when we'd kneel at it. At the end of each service, just after the sermon, the pastor would begin to suggest a need for response. This was called the altar call. Perhaps you've a secret sin that needs repented of, or perhaps there is something heavy going on in your life and you'd like to pray about it. Or, in a worst case scenario, perhaps you aren't adequately saved and need to pray through to full salvation. Well, in either case, as the preacher began to lead us toward the altar call, the pianist would begin to play a hymn. The hymn was usually one meant to convict us still further, calling each congregant forward should they need to or want to or desire to. If no one came after one or two verses of the hymn, the pastor might call them to pause the song so that they could make another plaintive plea. The stakes were sometimes raised very high. The preacher might say something to the effect, "If you died on the way home tonight, are you sure that you'd be ready?" As I said, the stakes were raised high, and often, by the time an altar call had run its course, half of the congregation or more, sometimes all of the congregation, might be up at the altar praying, crying, and then praying some more. And that would go on for some period of time. I can remember sitting through countless of these moments as a child. My child's heart in those moments was pulled in all directions. There were seasons in my life when I nearly always responded to the call before its end. I thought that this was the way it was in nearly every other church. I thought my experiences, as I've been describing, were the same experiences that others in other churches were experiencing. But as I alluded to earlier, I was wrong. I was well into adulthood when I finally realized that these experiences were not, per se, the usual in most other traditions. Perhaps I made it sound quite harrowing in the account above, but I am now aware that my childhood church was a modern iteration of a tradition that went back into the mid-1800s. For many Christians, especially those shaped by the Wesleyan and holiness traditions in which I was raised, the altar call was far more than a ritual at the end of a sermon. It was a sacred invitation to respond to God's grace in a tangible way. Countless believers can point to a worn wooden altar rail or a simple mourner's bench and say, "That's where my life changed." One man in my childhood congregation would recount setting his cigarettes on the altar at that moment when he was liberated from his addiction. Moments like these, I don't want to speak into with any kinds of criticism, because I've seen those moments change lives, despite the baggage those moments carried for me. The invitation could create space for repentance, prayer, surrender, and new beginnings, reminding people that faith calls not only for reflection, but also for response. Columnist Russell Moore writes in an article called "Bring Back Altar Calls," "The altar call at its best balanced the individual and the community." In other words, it offered a moment when a person's private encounter with God's grace became something the whole church could witness, encourage, and celebrate. Now, do I want to bring back altar calls? Not really. I could tolerate one now and again, and perhaps someday I will find myself kneeling at an altar in a similar way, but I'm not pining for them. But there are still many persons I know who believe that you can't really have church without them. I think differently now, but I, as for myself, who once thought that way, had to adjust. And this brings me back to the text that we read at the beginning. It begins with a conversation between John the Baptist's disciples and Jesus's. It's over the question of fasting and why Jesus' disciples don't do it. If compared to altar calls, a tradition younger than 200 years, by the way, in fasting we have a tradition that, by the time of Jesus, was far older and far more established. The earliest account we have of fasting in the Bible is in Exodus chapter 34, when Moses fasted 40 days on Mount Sinai, and that was around 1,400 years before the time of Jesus. By the time Jesus and John's disciples were having this discussion, fasting was baked into Jewish religious life. Indeed, it was mandatory for the devout believer. Quoting here from the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, "The law requires fasting only on the Day of Atonement. Although fasts might be declared in times of national emergency, or as a personal expression of supplication, mourning, or repentance, fasting, prayer, and almsgiving were signs of a righteous person. The Pharisees were said to fast twice a week. Therefore, outsiders expect Jesus' disciples to observe the pious custom of fasting as do the members of other Jewish sects devoted to holiness." All this to say, John the Baptist's followers were doing what had always been done from their perspective, and in the ways that it had been done for over 1,000 years. How dare anyone do otherwise? This is why Jesus was called to question. And here he contextualizes fasting, using an analogy of a bridegroom on his wedding. Fasting was a sign of supplication, mourning, or repentance, as was said just a moment ago in that quote. And these are not moods fit for a wedding, which is supposed to be a time of unbridled joy and hope. Jesus, in this passage, likens his own arrival to such a time. His coming and his bringing of God's realm with him were a time of feasting, not famine, a time for celebration and not sorrow. So, in his time and context, fasting made very little sense, for it failed to convey the spirit of that moment in history. Jesus then goes on to use two short parabolic metaphors to make the point still further. He says, if you sew a new patch on old fabric, once it is washed, the new patch will shrink. This is okay if it's sewn on to a new and unshrunken cloth. That way it'll all shrink together. But if it's sewn onto an already washed and shrunken cloth, the patch will tear away at the seams as it shrinks. He's making the case that practicing rituals and traditions that do not fit the moment are like this, that they end up tearing up the coat and ruining the whole thing, or in this case, tearing up the community and breaking it apart. The same point is made again by way of wine and wineskins, and this is the illustration that we'll stick with mostly through the remainder of our little talk here. It used to be that new wine, that is unfermented wine, think grape juice, was poured into leather containers where it could ferment. The animal skin was perfect for the job as it could stretch to account for the expansion of gases that resulted from the fermentation process. If this were done in, say, a sealed jar, the jar would crack open because the gas would have nowhere to go. But the effect would be the same if wine were put into old wineskins, skins that had already been stretched. These skins that had already been stretched to the maximum capacity, if used again, would burst open, and the wine and skin would be absolutely wasted and useless. And again, this is to compare to what happens in communities that can't adjust or adapt to new ways of being and doing. This point, quite simple. The old coat or old wineskins represents age-old traditions. The new patch or new wine represent new movements of God within those traditions. If those who hold the traditions are not flexible enough to move with the times and movements of God, the community will break apart and all would be lost. And what good is that? When we move this passage into a modern context, things become contentious. No doubt there will be in most communities a contingency of traditionalists who will defend the old ways to the bitter end. Conversely, there is likely to be a part of the community who are all for the new and want to throw out the old in a hurry. Jesus' teachings here in Matthew do not allow for either extreme. Note what he says. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins, otherwise the skins burst and the wine is spilled, and the skins are ruined. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and catch this last part, and so both are preserved. Biblical scholars believe that this last clause, so that both are preserved, is added so that communities hearing this teaching will not be too quick to throw out the old for the new. Let's keep the wineskins and the wine, the traditions and the community that is held by them. The goal is to keep it all. Eugene Boring writes in his commentary on Matthew, Jesus brings the eschatologically new in such a way that it does not do away with the old, but fulfills and preserves it. Throughout his gospel, Matthew affirms both old and new, refusing to join with superficial versions of either the conservative or the liberal movements in his church. Thus, Matthew's gospel can be read as quite conservative or very liberal, as Jewish or Gentile, as traditional or avant-garde, for it has elements of all of these. A blogger by the pen name Belgium Friar writes, "This new thing that God is about is indeed new, but that doesn't mean that the wine has none of the old ingredients in it. But it also means that if we don't get a new wineskin, that is, new structures and strategies to hold and to carry the new wine, we're going to lose everything." So, we must be adaptable on all sides, not rejecting old traditions wholesale, but rather recontextualizing them for our own moment. And we must not reject new movements of God within our traditions, clinging fast to what was in fear of the new and the unexplored. And in churches, I don't think I have to tell you, this becomes very difficult to do. We certainly have our traditions and ways of doing things, but we must never forget that these traditions were once brand new or innovations within older traditions that went before them. In fasting, Jesus' community was holding on to a tradition over 1,000 years old, but there is still a time and a place for everything. And if that tradition stops serving its purpose for a time, the community should adapt, and it will fail to do so at its peril. For those who could not imagine a world without fasting, Jesus gave them some encouragement, saying, if you count it, that a time would come when fasting would be appropriate again, but all things in due time. By the time I had my altar call experiences, the whole thing felt worn down and tired. Fewer and fewer churches, even within my childhood tradition, practiced it in those days, and still fewer today. Still, some old standbys still insist it is necessary. You can't have church without it. But other churches adapted. When all is said, it just isn't a hill worth dying on, in my opinion, and I think Jesus would agree. To die on such hills will tear apart the community, as we've been saying, pushing others away, or will cause divisions within local churches that make joyous fellowship difficult, if not impossible. And now I want to move it into my context, my church. What of us? What of Northwood Christian Church? We've traditions and ways of doing things, to be sure, but these traditions have failed to translate well to a culture that is quickly moving past us. In the 1950s, our way of doing things brought in the masses. Now, we are grateful when a stranger darkens our door. Do we just throw it all away and try to do something new or novel? Or do we Stay the course, tried and true. I say, you look to the grapes. Wine begins with grapes, and here I'm likening grapes to people. So you look to the people and what it is they need. Just as Jesus referred to the mission field as a harvest, we may think of this harvest as grapes. Grapes change with the soil, is what you must understand. And our soil, our culture, changes. A grapevine is remarkably sensitive to its surroundings. The same variety of grape planted in two different vineyards can produce fruit with noticeably different flavors, aromas, acidity, sweetness, and tannins. Much of this comes from what vintners call, I'm going to say this wrong, terroir. I don't know how to say that word. Terroir. And that's basically what that means, is the unique combination of soil, climate, rainfall, elevation, drainage, and countless other environmental factors that shape the vine's growth. A rocky hillside yields grapes unlike those grown in deep clay. A season of drought produces fruit different from a season of abundant rain. Even neighboring vineyards can harvest grapes with distinct characteristics because the land itself is different. The vine remains the same, but the fruit reflects the place where it has grown. And I liken that to people and cultures and places and times. Always different, always with subtleties. Sometimes those subtleties push back to vast differences, but we're all just grapes in the end. Actually, Jesus called the church, the body of his disciples, the vine. We, the church, can think of ourselves as the vine. And we will take the character and flavor of our soil, and the degree to which we may adapt will determine our harvest. Similarly, people change season to season, decade by decade, culture by culture, through time. We've been presented an opportunity to produce wine that is life-giving community, but is also unique and has never been tasted before, if we can be as new wineskins and adaptable. And our church at Northwood is full of an eclectic blend of grapes. You each represent different backgrounds, upbringings, social placements, and preferences. These preferences were informed by the nature of the soil, that is, your culture and the time and place where you live, where you were raised, where you've been. The trick is, how will we hold it all together as things change going forward? How will we hold this new wine in 2026 without our bursting at the seams? If we follow the parable, the key is to be flexible, adaptable. The key is to hold nothing so tightly that we cannot loosen a bit to let some of it go. The key is to be able to flex when new people arrive, flavored with their own unique soil, so that what forms in our church is good for us, so that we do not lose it all. Older traditionalists will continue to teach us the traditions while being able to adjust to new practices, new modes and methods. Newer folk will try to understand where the community has been, whilst also bringing with them the newness communities need to revitalize and to stay relevant. At Northwood, we should sing old songs and new. We should continue to gather around the table even whilst we set the table for different times and for different people. We should not resist new grapes or kinds of people and practices, but rather lean in to see how the newness they bring will, by way of God's grace, produce still newer life. And this requires us all, old and new, to be flexible as new wineskins. We might sing songs that you don't like, but we will still sing those old songs. We will sing old songs that seem dated to some, but we will still sing new songs. Songs that spring up from modern creative artists. We might incorporate new technologies, bringing our message out and into digital spaces, but we will still read from age-old scriptures. No one will have everything just the way they like it. That sort of selfishness will also break apart a community. But we will try and accommodate each other out of love for one another. And love, I remind you, cuts both ways. We must hold the harvest, the people God has given us at this time as best as we can in all their diversity and eccentricities. And this will, no doubt, stretch us. It will be hard, but it will make us stronger, more mature, and more loving followers of Jesus. I don't know everything the future holds for Northwood, but I know that we'll need to be as new wineskins, stretching to hold the life that animates our community. And the metaphorical wine will be, by God's grace, intoxicating, an intoxicating blessing, nourishing and rich for all of our neighbors to enjoy. This has been the Northwood Podcast. As we said at the start, if you want to learn more about us, please visit our website at www.indyncc.org. That's INDYNCC.org. Or perhaps you can write into me. My email is heath@indyncc.org. That's HEATH@INDYNCC.org. But that's all for today. Until next time, peace.